welcome back to the SaaS community channel, where we learn about building SaaS products from each other. And today I'm learning from the team Amberflow. So we have here Puneet, who is the CEO of Amberflow, and we have Lior, who is the CTO of Amberflow, and they're building usage-based billing. I know we had usage-based billing before here, but we're going to get a very different perspective and very different backstory from this team. So for me, it's exciting to hear different perspective to the same well-known problem. So awesome. Great to have you here.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Gwen. Good to be here.
Yeah, so let's start with Amberflow. Like you mentioned, there is a story behind the name.
When we were thinking about, well, once we had already decided we were going to do the company, then, you start thinking about, okay, what would be a good name? So the story is, from our time at AWS, we saw firsthand that this data, that the underlying data behind usage-based pricing and billing, right, which we can, I'm sure, get into quite a bit, metering data, is essentially the lifeblood of a cloud-native company. So, and that is, by the way, a topic in itself. We can talk about that at length. It's not just about pricing and billing, but certainly it is about pricing and billing for sure. So the idea, we've seen it firsthand up and close, where the lifeline, the lifeblood of a company is on the backs of this data. And so Amber name comes from the color gold. If it's the lifeline of the company, then it's basically, where the revenue flows in. Metering is sort of that river that is measuring what is being used, what is being consumed, and ultimately, what are you going to charge your customers in that flow? And the flow is then just the flow of the river. So, so that was sort of the thesis. It's hard to find a name these days, as you know, but that was kind of the thinking behind that, and a little bit of just again, sort of a page out of Amazon, having something, a name that starts with an A, is, just a little bit of an added benefit. So that's the backdrop story.
That is absolutely fantastic. I know from Confluent, obviously, that streams of events are always the lifeblood of a company. Right. We use this analogy many times, so I can definitely appreciate your point of view. And you mentioned Amazon's and the fact that you worked on this problem with Amazon, and that's really where I want to start diving a bit in, because my understanding is that you were there when usage-based billing was first introduced as a business model. So definitely tell us why did Amazon even do it?
Right, because when S3 was launched back in 2007, thereabouts, you could say just the fact that it was in the cloud and, it had some of the primitives of auto scale, elasticity. They didn't necessarily have to also add usage-based pricing. They could have just as well launched with a, what was very popular at the time, the subscription model. Yeah. So you have to ask the question of why did they even do that? Because there wasn't really any need. I mean, the service itself was disruptive enough that you didn't have to also add a model of usage-based pricing. So that's really the start of the story of usage-based pricing model. And this is basically what it is. There's a big debate, has always been around pricing, whether you are going to be a cost-based pricing model or a value-based pricing model. Okay, and it's still pretty active today. People say, hey, we are going to be a value-based. We're going to price our products on value-based. And with cloud now, there's an increasing model is sort of cost basis, because I know what my cost is, so I'm going to sort of do a cost plus model. See, the irony is basically they're one and the same, because if your backend is elastic, it's really about the optics. You know what your cost is on the backend. So even though you are basing your price on value, ultimately you can amortize that to your backend cost. So everything is ultimately a markup model. I may, if I'm offering you some value added service over a storage service, right? Clearly I can look at what my S3 cost is and I do some markup. And I say, it's a cost plus service. Okay, so S3 charges whatever, $20 per terabyte a month. I may charge you $25, $30 per terabyte a month, right? Now you may build an application which is still using S3 on the back end, but you say, I can charge you $100 per month because of the value that I provide. Fair enough, but at the end of the day, even that formula is cost plus. So instead of, if 20% markup or 30% markup, you have a 200% markup or 300% markup over your cloud cost. So call it whatever you want. Ultimately, what your backend cost is, and it's how much markup you want to have on top. And you can justify that either as a cost plus or as a value based.
So I'm hearing here two things. A, that basically because everyone has to worry about cloud costs, you really cannot ignore the economy. You have to take it into account into pricing. So no matter how you present it to your users, cost will have to be a big component, and you have to think about your margins and markup from day one. And that Amazon basically did usage-based billing for S3 because for them it was they had elasticity built into the product, so it was very natural for them to align the pricing with the elasticity of the implementation. Did I get it correct?
Exactly right. And then just the final, and what do you want to add to that is, so the debate wasn't cost plus versus value based, right? Clearly they were providing a value. It was disruptive, it was new. So the model was constructed not, should be priced based on value. So maybe we should charge a subscription because typically you can derive greater value if you charge subscription. That is not the narrative. You can claim as much value as you like on a cost plus model. Okay. And then of course there was the other artifact that, it was sort of a bottoms up approach. So they wanted to go after developers. Early days, even AWS didn't know how widely and how successfully would this service scale. So they could see that, on a usage-based model, there were no step functions. I mean, if it scaled, then the model would just scale. You wouldn't have to come up with another pricing tier, $50 per user or enterprise, $100 a user, anything like that. The model would just linearly scale to any amount of usage. So that was some of the backdrop that led them to long-term thinking, thinking about sort of streamlining it. And then ultimately they knew what their backend cost was, so they built a cost plus model. That's how they did it.
So there's still a lot of cloud services, especially the ones that don't sell to the, let's say, infrastructure sector, that is very subscription based. Like, I pay for Dropbox $100 a month for a specific size of storage. I probably use less than half of it. I still pay the same amount. Do you think eventually all of them will be usage-based billing?
We believe so. I think steadfastly. And I think for a couple of reasons. I think one is it's already starting to happen, right? I think, today as we're talking, February 2022, perhaps there was some doubt a couple of years ago, a few years prior to that. But now I think there's enough examples out there, companies who have been successful and have ran for a while outside of the big cloud providers. You mentioned obviously, Confluent, other companies, Twilio, Snowflake, pretty much every new company that's coming on cloud native is now showing that the usage-based model is a better model. So one is sort of that trend, right? And we can talk more about that, what's really driving it. Clearly, there's evidence now that both for consumers and for companies, it's a better model, right? Drives adoption, organic adoption, lowers barriers to adoption. Customers find it more fair. It's more fair and transparent, pay only for what you use. So now it becomes a question of, some of these higher value added services or, sort of services applications farther up the stack, does it make sense for them to be usage-based? And I believe the answer is absolutely yes, because the other thing that I think companies are going to realize as time goes on, irrespective of the kind of business you're at, right? Whether it's an application business, PaaS, or infrastructure. Like I said earlier, if your backend is elastic, then for you to, build a company and continue to drive operational efficiency, the stuff in the middle. So your revenue base coming in and your cost base is on the back end. The stuff in the middle, the operational efficiency, for you to optimize that and put that on a maturity curve, you have to align what is being consumed on the front end to what is it that you're paying on the back end. And if the back end is elastic, then you will find that gradually you're going to gravitate towards putting your front end, and when I say front end, what the customers are paying and how they're paying, on an elastic basis.
Yeah, I will also add that, you can see from Slack fair pricing, right? Actually, how many users actually using this month, right? So you see those metered components, and for your example, Dropbox, it has this bucketing. And what is more fair, that you will pre-buy, you'll subscribe to this X amount of gigabytes, or you actually pay of how much you really used? And
Yeah,
those kind of models are.
it's absolutely, and I think Slack got almost the ability to charge more because of this fairness. Like at first I was really concerned about the pricing, and then I was like, oh, but actually most of my users don't really say anything and I don't have to worry about the pricing.
That's as a community you're asking, right? So
how many? The community I did not actually pay. We still have like 140 something active users, and our startup is incredibly small and new. So the community is on the free community version. But for our company, we invited a bunch of like friends and advisors, and we were a bit concerned because like I'm literally paying it out of my credit card at this point. So I was definitely worried, and I think if they didn't have the model where if someone does not say anything, I don't pay for them, I probably wouldn't have.
Makes sense. Just fair. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, so I want to switch tacks a bit, because obviously the way people do usage-based billing is kind of resource intensive, right? They have to actually track all the usage, and a lot of people already track all the usage, right? I mean, I have Datadog, it monitors my system, so I kind of have throughput metrics out of that. So naively, I may ask, could I just send you my Datadog APIs and you will build from that, or is it more involved?
It requires a different platform primitive or the building block, so to speak. And here's the reason why. And actually, again, Lior spent a lot of time in sort of ETL and observability side of the house, and he'd be the first to say. But let me sort of put out some key nuggets. Now, the good news is, today there's enough evidence. So, to back my claim, what I'm going to say next. One is clearly AWS and the large cloud providers have had to build a new primitive outside of observability or monitoring or logging. But I think even as you go and talk with some of these new companies that we just talked about earlier, Twilio, Snowflake, Mongo, Databricks, they're all going to say they've had to build internally what they call the cloud metering service. Okay. So yeah, let's talk about what's different, because this is clearly an important aspect. And unfortunately, some companies will perhaps discover this after the fact. But if there's one thing that we would evangelize, and we would want to share some of the best practices from our experience from AWS, is the following: that get metering right. Metering is the starting point for you to move towards a usage-based business model. Okay.
So what is metering, and how do I know I got it right? Yeah. It seems like it's an important thing for everyone to understand.
That's right. All right. So let's sort of distill down on what is metering, and also how is it different from, let's say, quote unquote other metrics oriented tools, as you talked about, logging, observability, and sort of other close cousins of that. So here's the basic fundamental difference and why there is a need for metering and why it's emerging as a category, in addition or outside of logging and observability. A couple of things. One is metering is, so, why you need a metering system is over time, you want to be able to gather a set of data, usage data, and you want to be able to look back in time and point a finger to that data set and always be able to answer the question that the data in that system is accurate.
Okay, so metering is accurate.
And that's a big thing because, you cannot take this lightly. And that's why I use the term that historical, and for the following reason, because clearly, this is going to feed into your pricing and billing. So certainly if you're going to be billing a customer out of a usage and consumption data artifact, that data better be accurate, because some customer is going to raise their hand if they find that they have been, that bill doesn't look right. They're going to come back to you and say, I need more clarification, or I need some audit trail. And then you're going to have to look back and internally ask the question, is the data trail accurate? Okay. So at the foundational level, metering has this design principle that it needs to be an accurate system of record of usage and consumption data. Okay, so that's the design thesis. Now the question is, okay, so then still, how is it fundamentally different from, let's say, a logging, monitoring, and observability tool? So if you're going to say that I'm going to build a system of record that is going to be accurate all the time, then you work your way backwards from that design thesis and you arrive at some technology artifacts like item potency and data deduplication. Okay. And this is important because arguably, logging, observability, some may have it, but will not have it to the extent where they can guarantee you that every record ingested was treated in an item potent way. Just, for the audience, item potent basically means that when I get a record in, I'm going to process it once and once only. But let's round this whole thing out. So what that means is I cannot not process it, and I cannot process it twice. Okay, and this is
if I send you the same record twice by mistake.
Great. So that is the deduplication part of the design principle. Okay, so first is item potency, which is huge because ultimately this is a distributed system, and guaranteeing item potency in a distributed auto scale system, it's a relatively hard problem to solve, right? Because if it's a distributed system, any node or any part of the process can fail as the record is going through various stages of transformation. And then to guarantee item potency, you have to build that at the platform layer. So that's item potency. Then next is, as you said, it's very common because metering is ingesting data from different sources, and you yourself could be operating a distributed system, so you may be sending duplicate records at the same time. So that's the design principle of data deduplication, right? So the system and the platform of metering should be smart enough to dedupe your records, process them in idempotent way. So now I can always look back at this data set, and I can always count on it on being accurate. I don't think I can say the same about a logging system or an observability system.
Yeah, you're right. It has just very different requirements and they're built to. So it's interesting. And maybe that's more of a question for Lior. When I used Kafka a lot, and it always felt like a trade-off. Either you want to never ever slow down the producers of the data and never have any impact on the production systems that you are measuring, or you want every bit of information to always get to the end of the pipeline.
Yeah.
And it's Kafka has some mechanisms to make sure you can do both, but there are still situations where you really cannot. So I'm curious, how did you balance those trade-offs?
So for sure, I'll just get one question before that you ask about Datadog, and I think it's clear that matrix for Datadog for operations, if you miss an hour, or if you start a cluster and you missed it for an hour because some configuration issue, fine, we will live without that section. But when talking about metering, not, of course, billing, when you want to bill somebody, but even not billing, if you only show back your customer the usage of he has of your system, you don't want to mess that up too. So that's different guarantees and So totally different guarantees, and that's become very, very clear that metering that's where it starts to really differ from metrics. Yeah, from operational metrics.
So metering is metrics that are 100% accurate, exactly once,
Yes.
and
when you really need that
mission critical metric.
System of record for customer usage.
Yeah,
that's exactly that. When you don't do that like in analytics out of the fact that it's not like, oh, how many used IE or Chrome, but really need to get accurate usage, that's metering. And for the question of for the trade-offs about losing records, processing at least once or at most once, or and all of that stuff. So as Puneet said, we really made deduplication a big part of the system and idempotency, so you'll always be able to replay whatever happened. And that's kind of what that's the design principle. So our clients will always retry even if they're not sure, and the server side will always know how to dedupe them. So we define that record ID that we can keep track. And we keep on promise that if an event happened in a specific time, it can only happen once. So if you send it 100 times more, we will dedupe it.
Do you try to rate control how often the clients set information, like on my system, or can I accidentally DDoS you if I have something really big?
So it's a good question. So we scale pretty easily. So we all like serverless and do all of that to be really scalable.
Yeah.
So it will take some time to
so much fun to build an architecture from scratch.
That's true. That is true. You know, we build the same way that we're thinking about how this is done in AWS, and it's all serverless. And so it's really hard to DDoS us, but yeah, we fight it in the normal DDoS mechanism.
And I will add, Gwen, so just since we were talking about metering, so that's the design principle, that's the starting point. But metering service is then few things added on top of that, right? And that really what sort of covers sort of the full spectrum of a turnkey, so what we would call, a full-featured, fully managed metering service, right? Okay, so we talk a lot about ingestion, and within ingestion, idempotency, data deduplication is the design principle. But then there is the life cycle or the workflow of how the event, sort of goes through the metering service and what is the output of that. So clearly the entire pipeline is idempotent data deduplication, so that gives you accuracy. But then some of the core constructs, sort of the features that are part of the metering service is data ingestion, data aggregation, data transformation, slicing data over a time series, right? Doing this in real time and giving you, like I said, in real time, an aggregated view. So you can basically define rules on as these events are coming in, how do you want to look at the usage, right? So for example, instance hours are just, how many hours the instance ran. And you can ask the metering service on this day between 12 a.m. to 9 p.m., how many hours was the instance up? That's the job of a metering service, right? So it's the ingestion, collection, pooling, transformation of this data, and giving you this information back.
It's fascinating because you talk about those different views, and the things that it reminds me is that there's actually very old usage-based billing examples in the world. And I was thinking about my electricity metering, and they actually, the PG&E have changed the rush hour billing rules, and now I'm no longer allowed to do laundry between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. And is that something that you see that people are getting into, or because from what I see, usually you pay per event, some kind of an event or something that you do, but it's not that sophisticated. Do you think it'll get more sophisticated?
Yeah, no, I think it is.
By the way, a lot of origins from no, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it is, so you talked about a couple of things. So one is we like to look at the world sort of from two lenses. One is metering, and then I think what you sort of touched on is the rating aspect, the pricing aspect, right? And certainly, there are some creative models out there. Utilities, things like electricity and telecom have sort of been the leading domains, where I think really their old school or the Gen 1 metering concept really sort of came through. But in the world of cloud, largely as pioneered by AWS, as we talked about, The design principle for end-to-end is pretty simple. You have a metering service. It is decoupled from pricing and billing, integrated but decoupled. What does that mean to be decoupled? It is a first order platform service. It operates independently. Okay, they are a class of users, constituents inside a company that will work with a metering service that are completely unbeknownst to what the final pricing plan and billing model will be or ought to be. Okay, metering is first and foremost usage instrumentation of your technology stack. What was used by whom, when, what, where, how much. How much did that cost, or how you wish to price that, is now shifting gears into pricing and billing. So pricing and billing provides you the modeling. So we look at pricing and billing as an application. Metering is the platform. Okay. In fact, even at, as in terms of best practices, again, learn from our past experience, we advise companies that start with metering, run metering independent of pricing and billing, at least for a billing cycle. So you get to see usage patterns emerge, because you cannot back your way into metering from pricing and billing. That is the wrong approach in our view. The right approach is start with metering. Metering is the way forward. Once you have this data, this raw data, now this raw data has a lot of intelligence in it, and it will inform you of ultimately what your customer facing pricing and billing ought to be, which vectors you need to charge on. Within each vector, how do you want to price that, right? So that comes secondary, but first you got to put the system in place, let it build the data set, and now you can model different pricing and billing. And within that, as you were saying, there's some creative ways of how you can price, there are different artifacts of how you price usage-based business models.
This is fascinating, because if I'll tell you my journey when we built it, a lot of the instrumentation was added because we needed to bill in a certain way. So just as an example, when Confluent added partition billing, we discovered that actually Kafka did not have a metric for number of partitions. It is funny because it always had a metric for number of partitions, but it was per broker. And if a leader did a leader election, moved from one broker to another, we counted it twice. And that was it caught even in QA that we're clearly inflating the builds every time I'm restarting a cluster. Right. And we ended up adding a new metric for Kafka, which is cluster-wide partition count, which is a bit hard in a distributed system, but stuff was figured out. So in my mind, moving from metrics to billing is actually the hard part. But if you know what you want to bill, adding in the metrics is kind of the way to go. You were telling me that we were doing it all wrong. How do you know what to measure if you don't know what you'll charge?
Yes, great question. So it's actually not that difficult. Let me tell you why. It's really the approach. It's just that simple. And I think one of the opportunities in front of us is really just to change a little bit of this mindset. I wouldn't even say change the mindset. I think it's just evolving. There are not many companies who have already gone down the path of usage-based pricing, but they're starting to, clearly, right? And I think, like I said, one of the things that we can put out and really share as sort of one single nugget, start with metering first. You're going to thank yourself down the road. This is really the foundation that you're going to put in place to sustain you for long-term growth, give you that accuracy, give you that system of record upon which you can build, optimize, fine-tune your pricing plans and other functional areas inside the company. So perhaps back then, the reason why it didn't happen that way, here's our view, okay? See, the whole act of metering, as we discussed, is relatively new. So you could ask the question of why has metering not evolved to where today logging is, observability is, and so forth. And the reason is actually quite simple, because there wasn't really a need, right? In a subscription model, where it is a subscription model is what we would term sort of what's called a single dimension model, right? Usually you price on a user. Is it $25 per user per month, or 50, 100, or whatever your plan is. So it's a single dimension pricing plan. But more importantly, subscription models, money was collected upfront. The term was discussed upfront. Money changed hands upfront. So there was no incentive for anybody to, on the back of it, go and actually meter to see what was actually being used. Nobody was incentivized to do it. The vendor collected money upfront, so they were not incented to do it. And the company that paid perhaps would have liked to, but they'd already paid. So even if they metered it, it's not like they were going to get any money back, right? So the metering artifact never really emerged. And therefore, the first companies like yours, and others, sort of the first foray into usage-based pricing, they naturally work their way backwards from pricing and billing. Because as we're going to follow the AWS model, or we're going to do usage-based pricing. Let's think about, what are the vectors we're going to charge on? And then obviously you need the meters for that. So you went back and put those meters in the place. So that's the reason why it happened this way. Thinking about the other way is really just a thought process change, right? Also, keep in mind, there weren't any robust metering tools that were available to you at the time. You had no choice but to build it yourself. And, no surprises, time to market, speed, you sort of do what's the bare minimum to do it so that you can kind of get to market. But if today, let's say Eyes Closed, whether it's us or anybody else, if you have a off-the-shelf, robust, highly scalable, durable, cost-effective, very important, cost-effective metering platform, you can certainly start with metering and then going forward. And metering is essentially eyes closed, just instrument your technology stack. I can't overemphasize this enough. Just don't even think, but what features your product has. You need to instrument them. What features those features are using of the cloud technology infrastructure. You need to meter those, right? So you need to build this metering framework, and you can only do it if there is a technology primitive out there that's not going to charge you an arm and a leg, where you don't have to stop every time you have to create a new meter. Oh my God, how much is this going to cost me? And what would this mean? I have to go seek permission and new budget. It cannot be like that. So that is the job of a metering service. We believe we're going to get to that place, and that is the right place. And once you have that in place, it's the life becomes a lot simpler, believe me.
Yeah, I can totally see that if I had an easy way to collect all the usage information on my platform, life would be a lot simpler. I'm struggling with how easy it is really, because usage has, as you said, just so many different dimensions. And again, I'm going back to my past experience. I mean, just Kafka alone had, I don't know, 500 different metrics, something like that. If I gave a product manager 500 different metrics and say, figure out how to price, they would tell me that I'm making a bad joke. Nobody can handle this kind of scenario. Do you have I don't know, cheat sheet, where do people who already have a system, and I think that's most of the people you talk to probably have some system running and are thinking how to build, they're not building the system from scratch. Where do people realistically start?
Well, we can certainly share with you sort of how we did it at AWS, right? And again, we like to think there's certainly some best practices there. So you're right, there is clearly a superset of meters to price ratio, no question about it. But keep in mind, and that's why, like I said, we can already kind of see just our discussion. If it's important, you have to decouple it. So don't be, our advice would be, don't be saddled by the fact that you have tens or even hundreds of meters that you're tracking. It's good. Track whatever you can. It's the modern world. Usage tracking is a good thing, right? So track anything and everything that you can track. And yes, of course, and then the question is not, okay, I'm tracking 200 meters, so my customer facing pricing plan is going to be 200 items. No, that's not the case. But tracking is, like I said, is the first order bit. Track to gauge real-time intelligence, what is happening, what is being used where, which features are being driven, how does your technology stack stretches left to right, top to bottom, based on what kind of usage patterns you're seeing. Then the exercise cannot be, you cannot shortcut or fast track the exercise of then building and constructing your customer facing pricing plan, right? That is, to be honest with you, no different than how you would then look to price a product that you're bringing to market, right? You have a discussion on what is the value, who are the customers, who are the users, you know, how they view it. And that is usually follows, usually, of course, you know, that also becomes a function of the domain, you know, your product, your audience. And then but you have the systems and the tooling in place. So now you can align the two, right? And then what we discussed earlier, now you want to say cost plus or how much margin, here's the value. You have full data and you can sort of instrument that and you can build that model.
I have to ask this, maybe you will tell me that you cannot answer, but you brought up several times the idea of aligning costs with value and with pricing. And obviously cloud costs is such a gigantic pain point. And even if I instrument my product to this, it doesn't actually help me a ton in figuring out my cloud costs because there is a lot of hidden costs there. Like Kafka is running on Kubernetes, but no amount of Kafka instrumentation will tell me how much I'm paying for my managed Kubernetes. Are you thinking of assisting people with that side of the world as well?
It's definitely
sure.
sides of the same coin. Yeah,
that's right. I think that's really the way to look at it. So let's go back to, I think, you know, what you asked us earlier, the founding thesis of Amberflow, how we looked at sort of this lifeblood of a company. So cloud business, modern cloud companies, cloud native companies, as we already discussed, your backend is elastic, your costs are elastic. And then in a usage-based pricing model, your front end is elastic. We talked about metering, instrumenting your technology stack, building a usage-based pricing and billing model. Metering, no surprises, is also the artifact that ultimately solves your cost optimization problem. Okay, so let's talk about this. You're right, you know, not everything can be distilled down to a meter just yet, but those are essentially the outlier cases. What the case that you sort of outlined, you know, Kafka running in a Kubernetes cluster, though even we'll say even that you can really come very close to instrumenting and figuring out what is it costing you on the back end, right? So I'll say the following. So, you know, that again, metering service, there are two types of meters. They are the customer facing usage meters, what my customer is using on my technology. And then there are the cost meters, internal facing cost meters. What am I using from the cloud provider? Okay, so this is a big leap. It's not there today. What I'm getting at is, you know, today, if you want to get a handle on your cost, the model is vendors kind of look at your AWS bill, and then they parse the AWS bill, and they kind of give you some insights into how you may optimize something, right? Yeah. That's about how far we've gotten. The right way to get ahead of your cost is, again, back to the metering infrastructure. You deploy your own cost meters. Every time you are provisioning something on the cloud, you use the metering service to basically have your metering service as part of your control plane. Nothing happens by itself. There's something, either there's a Terraform script, there's some event that triggers some cloud usage.
No, that's fantastic. I think it's every engineering manager dream to stop deployments that are going to be expensive before anyone has a chance to actually deploy them. So I am so excited to hear that at least I know that startups from idea until I can actually download and install the GitHub plugin that will stop the merges from happening. It may take a bit, but it's really exciting that you are toying with this idea, because yeah, this is literally kind of accidental cost overruns are such
totally, yeah,
concern.
Yeah, no, we're having a lot of fun. I mean, this is super exciting, and of course, as it's still sort of early days, early beginnings, but this is a proven out thesis. This is not all experimentation. This is really how it is done at the large cloud provider areas. I can tell you personally, I was lucky to run a couple of services at AWS, and cost optimization is a big deal at AWS, at Amazon in general, particularly at AWS. I can tell you, as a matter of fact, I wasn't waiting for my bill to figure out how to optimize. We had a metering service that gave me those insights.
And I mean, at the end of the day, with pricing on one side and cost on the other side, you let people focus on optimize their business margins.
Exactly.
Margins are such an important driver of the value of the business.
Exactly.
So yeah, like this is it's definitely, like, I promised listeners they will have a unique take on the area, and they definitely got a very unique take. Do you see people, and maybe that's more a question for Lior, your customers or people you talk to, trying to architect their entire backend toward more cost elasticity and pricing elasticity? That it's not like the planning has to start even before someone adds a metric, essentially, or a meter, sorry.
Yeah, I think we definitely see, I mean, they are aware. They are aware with that. Either they're, kind of more advanced, they already are doing some kind of usage-based pricing, trying to revamp, making more real-time, really getting more real-time analytics on that, and really connect it to a billing pipeline, or just even, having those customer-facing matrix versus backend costs. I mean, they're all looking at that. And I would say their backend is usually already like that. I mean, today when you're building a platform, that's, I think, there's a good awareness. So people are building for elasticity in the front end, elasticity in the back end. And yeah, and they're definitely coming to us to help with this journey. But I think this already is there. It's more about tying them together.
And so you said that people build for elasticity, but I'm wondering if they build for taking advantage of the cloud cost structures.
So we have a few that actually work with, Lambdas, right? So you basically, we're Lambda, and maybe the reason we're using Lambdas is this, unit of cost really tied to a workload, like a specific customer running a specific API. So you can actually take this data and, that's where it all comes from. You really have a unit of cost for this load. So we see it for people that are using serverless. That's definitely comes to mind when they build that, and we do the same way. How much time, you mentioned Kubernetes container run, so processing time, even if you don't get the cost, the dollar amount, being able to track the processing time of a workload to have an amortized, what's the cost is, to have kind of like an amortized score for a customer, how much is he using your resources. Those are definitely part of the use cases we saw so far.
Yeah, and I think that with really platforms that give you this level of visibility, we will actually see a lot more people saying, oh, this container is costing me 24/7. I'm actually only using it 3 hours a day. I know because I have the metering data to prove it.
That's right.
And therefore, the engineering effort to move it to serverless is going to pay off.
That's right.
So we can definitely see this happening. We are pretty much out of time. I really want to thank you for really great insights. You introduced a new concept into, I think, everyone's lexicon. And I think you helped people think about how to build toward usage-based billing from the ground up, which is super valuable. So I really appreciate having you here.
Very cool, Gwen. Yeah, it was great to be with you. Thank you. This is great to have a chat about this.
Thank you very much, Gwen.